Mr. Rice is a software engineer and volunteer in the NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador Program. Tony is also a contributor to WRAL Spaceflight and Astronomy topics. Mr. Rice spent some time with meteorologists at the 45th Weather Squadron at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, and will describe how they provide the weather forecast needed to safely get our space missions underway. So please give me your attention. Take it away, Tony.
Very much. So, I understand that there's a couple of folks in the audience that are also some fans of weather. Is that true? Do we have any weather spotters here? No, Ian is. Up your eyes, and I think everybody else will get a kick out of it too. Who here has been down to the Cape for a launch? Who here saw the launch go off on time? Who here had a scrub for weather as a part of their trip down there? All right, so what I hope tonight is to share with you a little information about why that is, because when you're down there, especially if you're not part of the official Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex contingent, you may not even be able to hear the public address announcer tell you what's going on. I got to meet George Diller, the public affairs officer down at the Cape a couple of months ago, and I told him, as I was chatting with him, I said, my wife hates the sound of your voice. He just kind of looks at me. He said, why in the world is that? I said, because you're the bearer of bad news as far as she's concerned. It's the first voice you hear when there's a scrub, and you can see the weather coming in over the horizon, and you know what's happening. And he always starts out the same way. He says, well, doesn't look like we're going to get to fly today. So my wife got to really hate the sound of his voice on STS-127, I believe it was. It was one of the most frequent attempts for a shuttle launch. And we didn't end up getting to see it. We saw, I want to say, 3 attempts, and the crowd kept getting smaller and smaller. We were down there on some passes that our congressperson had nicely provided for us. And the first time we went, we were out on the NASA Causeway. The second time we went, we were a little bit farther up on the NASA Causeway. And by that third time, I think we had moved our flight a couple of times to accommodate this. We were down there at Disney World. I'd spent as much time as we could stand at Disney World. We're back trying to see that flight, and that time they moved us to the VIP section, which was kind of nice, up at the Saturn V Center. We were sitting in front of the contingent. There was a Canadian astronaut going up on that flight. We sat in front of the contingents from the Canadian Space Agency. Really nice people, lots of fun to be around. They love making science and supporting their astronauts. So let's get started. So this is a little bit about me. I mentioned that I am a part of the Solar System Ambassador Program. I spend a lot of time in schools, but I spend a lot of time with meteorologists too, and it's something I've kind of developed over my time with the program. They're great fun to deal with, especially broadcast meteorologists. They're one of the few scientists that are going to be in the newsroom, so try to get them the tools they can. So this is me up in the left-hand corner at the 45th Weather Squadron. I'll give you some more information on those folks. Some of the most dedicated people I've ever run into. They're really, really serious about their science. They're really serious about the weather, and they also love America a whole lot and want to get the rockets off safely. And they're the ones that are, in a lot of cases, ultimately giving the last call on go, no go when it comes time to make a decision on whether they actually launch the rocket or not. So two things about me up in the upper right-hand corner. That's my Twitter handle, my personal one on top. I'm obviously a very big fan of weather, so I put out a Twitter feed. This is all automated. It's running out there on a server, but it brings down the daily weather report from the Mars rover Curiosity, and that's her in the right-hand corner there. Actually, the duplicate we have here on Earth. When things come up on Mars that the team needs to figure out, this is in Pasadena. It's in a very unassuming garage out in the hills of Pasadena, in the Mars yard, where they can replicate some of the conditions on Mars, the different sand consistencies and the different slopes that they have to deal with. So this is the Mars weather report there in the left-hand corner from the last report that came out on December 8th. So you can see it's kind of chilly there, but it's actually warmed up quite a bit. Yes?
So this is the link, how to get to that? Or is that
those are Twitter feeds. So if you go to twitter.com/MarsWX report, you'll be able to get to that. And RTP Hokey is my personal account, and I put all sorts of geeky space stuff out there. So let's get started. So why do we even care about the weather? Why do we look at the weather when it comes to launching rockets? As we go through this couple of slides here, you're going to see that it's it's something that's definitely evolved over time, and there's been a couple of incidents that have happened that are weather-related. It really taught us a lot about what we look for, what kind of criteria need to be there. But this kind of speaks back to that first question I asked about, has anybody been down to the cave? And the hands that I saw kind of match what we're seeing here. This was a photo I took of a big board they have down at the 45th Weather Squadron. Yes? Is it? Cool. You want to switch me to hand mic?
But something that's not the world's cheapest battery. How's that?
Well, I'll stop doing that. Sorry. Cool. We'll get the audio engineer back on it and see if that fixed it. Is that any better? Awesome. So battery fix. Sometimes that's actually a fix on the pad too, if batteries have to be changed out. But this is as you walk into the weather squadron, this is what they got front and center to be able to show off to some dignitaries and things like that. This kind of matches up with what you were seeing there. So of the launches that this covers, like 1988 to about, I want to say it was about 2010, if I remember right. But they had a total of 654 launches from the Cape that they've been involved in. And I'll show you the launch pads that will indicate what they are normally involved with. This is just Cape Canaveral. There's a contingent that is at Vandenberg as well that does the same kind of thing, but I'm just focusing on Cape Canaveral for now. So 60% of them actually launch on time, and on time means that first launch attempt, or a launch goes off on that first launch attempt. 40% are scrubbed, meaning they have to stand down, in a lot of cases defuel the rocket, probably 24-hour turnaround, maybe more depending on the vehicle. So of those ones that launch during that first launch attempt, and that's during that first launch window. And launch windows can be anywhere from 10 minutes. The shuttle was about a 10-minute launch window. During some of the latter shuttle missions that were going up to the International Space Station, very tight window there because you're basically playing catch-up with something that's not going to wait for you. Something that's going 17,500 miles an hour, and you've got to catch up to it. Delays, meaning somewhere in that launch window, we probably were able to launch it, so about 40% of those. So if you look at the whole picture here, 35% of launch delays are due to weather. So again, that's on that first day, that first launch attempt. We're actually able to get it off, but we have to wait for weather. 47% of launch scrubs are due to weather. And 27% of launches overall were impacted by weather. So weather's a big deal. And that's why if you've ever sat and watched a full broadcast from beginning to end of a rocket launch, you're going to hear that launch poll that goes on. And they're going to poll everybody who's involved with it. They're going to poll the folks that are involved with the payload, of course, the vehicle. There may be multiple parts of the vehicle. There may be some folks that are concerned only with solid rocket boosters versus the liquid-fueled rocket. But also, you're always going to hear the launch weather officer, and they're going to have a say in whether or not the launch weather criteria has been met or violated. So here's a couple of items, why this matters, why this exists, and what the folks down at the Weather Squadron are doing. They're not just doing weather forecasting for launch day. Certainly a big part of what they do, but they also do forecasting for operations around the base. If there's a large, say the payload is being moved across the Kennedy Space Center property, they're going to do some weather forecasting for things like winds. There are tolerances that have to be met, and they're not going to move that unless those tolerances are met. A lot of times they will move things at night because the winds tend to be a lot calmer at night, especially down in Florida. Launch operations. The big ones there are lightning, wind, and visual rules, and we'll see why in a moment. And then also they have to think about things like disasters. Should that vehicle explode on ascent? Should that vehicle explode on the launch pad? We have to think about where that plume might go. What are the prevailing winds? How fast are the winds? Are they going to take it over a populated area? This is all programmed into the commit criteria. So there's a set of rules that they're going across during every polling to determine whether they're going to go or they're not going to go. And I didn't mention it here, but the other thing that they're doing on a continual basis is feeding wind data into the vehicle. Now, this wasn't so much a factor down in the early days, in the even up to Apollo, but especially like Gemini or Mercury days. Those weren't as maneuverable of a vehicle, but when it comes to something like an Atlas V rocket that's going to be taking something like the Curiosity rover up, or certainly shuttle, or the vehicle that we saw most recently with the Orion launch, the Delta IV Heavy, those are highly maneuverable vehicles, and they need the latest wind data at the various levels so that they can steer properly. Please.
When you mentioned that the bloom might go towards a populated area, what might be hazardous as far as any hazardous chemicals or something?
There's all sorts of things that get launched on these rockets. Now, the rocket fuel itself is basically kerosene. Not all that hazardous, certainly flammable, something the local fire company is going to want to know about, but it's not super hazardous. But any vehicle that's being launched, any spacecraft that's being launched that has hypergolic fuels on board, something that does not require a spark to create a fire. You put two chemicals together, like you go to the hardware store and you buy those syringes full of epoxies, same kind of idea. Put part A with part B and you get something useful. Same idea in orbit. Those are more toxic.
A chemical reaction.
Exactly, a chemical reaction. Those are more toxic, that you don't want that floating over a populated area. And then the deep space missions, they've got to be powered somehow. And anything that's going out about past Jupiter is probably going to be powered with a nuclear source. So we want to know about those sorts of things.
Sometimes it would almost seem to me as if you might think to build a launch vehicle that would be much more weather resistant and not have to be delayed due to certain weather conditions, other than, say, lightning.
Yeah, we certainly could, but any resistance you put in a vehicle is going to add weight. And weight is terribly, terribly expensive. I forget the number off the top of my head, but every pound that you put on a rocket, well, number one, it's a pound of science that you can't put on there. So that's something to consider. But every pound you put on a rocket is many thousands of dollars. Yes, sir.
Okay, to add to that, when I was in elementary school, I grew up near the Cape, and I vividly recall going out for recess one day, and there's just this huge fireball hanging in the sky.
What was it?
It was a failed rocket. What happened was that the developer had actually left I think it was a semicolon off his Fortran code, or it was anyway, bottom line, it blew up. So for me, from my standpoint, I'm certainly glad that the fireball was going in the other direction, not towards our playground. Some of those fires also too, I mean, can be invisible. You can't see a hydrogen, or you can't visually see a hydrogen fire. But so, and then also too, there is falling debris.
Right.
I mean, you don't want one of those things to fall down on the playground where your kids are. Because, I mean,
and there's an elementary school very close to this.
Yeah, it was very close. So
Yeah.
I mean, it was like very vivid. So I mean, your point's well taken. You definitely want to make sure that those things are the winds blowing in the opposite direction, not towards the school ground.
And that's why the launch pads are located where they are, right on the coast. They launch out over the water, and it's for safety reasons. Now, anything that's launched from Cape Canaveral is going to be going into an orbit that is not polar. We can't launch polar orbits from Cape Canaveral. We could, but we would overfly right here, and that's not something that we're really all that interested in. So any polar missions are going to launch from Vandenberg, where they can launch due south, just because of the shape of the California coastline. So this is a bit of an eye chart, but I've color-coded it in a couple of places, and actually back up to the previous slide. Does anybody, this is a horrible picture, but we took horrible pictures in the 60s, so there's nothing I can do about that, but does anybody recognize this picture? It's lightning. What's it hitting?
It's a Saturn V.
It's a Saturn V. Anybody know the mission? All right, let's see if we can figure it out on the next one. You don't get to answer, because you know the answer. The fix for this is a Saturn V. They got hit on ascent by lightning. The lightning was triggered by the rocket itself. So that's a consideration that needs to be made. It's not just lightning in the area we need to look for. Rockets can trigger lightning themselves. Smoke plumes can trigger lightning. It will follow the particles in the smoke plume down. So this is a Saturn V, and the fix was to resolve the problem, because the rocket, basically all of the systems on board rebooted. And the fix to get things back up and running. Again, we're going uphill at this point. We've got Apollo astronauts on board. We're going to the moon. This was a manned mission. The fix was one lone engineer, young engineer. Probably the first thing he said on a console headset was, "I think you could try SCE to OS, and let's see if that fixes it." So that's kind of a lesson to always listen to the young engineers, because sometimes they know what they're talking about. Let's see if we can figure out which mission it was. So look at this eye chart here. Here's all of the manned Apollo missions. Well, starting with 11, we have the unmanned ones here as well. We'll have the non-moon landing ones here as well. Let's see, based on the weather data here, you can tell me which one of these resulted in a lightning strike. Any guesses? It's Apollo 12, yeah. Yeah, it was Apollo 12. So the thing to look at here is cloud cover and also rain. So these are all percentages of the sky that were covered by clouds at the time. And the reason I throw up this eye chart is just to kind of give us a sense of history that led into some decisions that were made during the shuttle program, and then things that happened during the shuttle program, we'll get to there, that led to decisions being made going forward. So look at this. We launched into rain. We don't do that anymore. We launched into 100% covered sky. The really interesting thing about the Apollo program and the Skylab program that followed after it, there were no scrubs. We launched on the first attempt on every one of those missions. We launched a little bit late on one of them. I think we delayed by 40 minutes for weather. But looking at these conditions here, we would have never launched shuttle in most of these conditions. We needed much better weather. But the point you made about how hardy that vehicle was, shuttle was fairly delicate, and it was mostly because of those the tiles that were protecting the shuttle on re-entry. Those were fairly delicate, so we needed to keep that in mind when it came to launch conditions. But here we got 100% sky coverage. It's raining. Look up here at barometric pressure. I've put this down into millibars. The ones that are red, I want to say 30.25 is about mid-range for barometric pressure. So you see these things are kind of low here. So there's low pressure systems over the Cape at the time. That matches up nicely here. We actually had some here. So you can see kind of cloudy, stormy conditions. Those are the kind of conditions that are going to block visibility, so you can't see the rocket going up. Pretty important during the Apollo time frame, but became very important during shuttle. Look at these clouds here. So these are different altitudes of clouds. So these are low-level clouds here, and we get into super high levels of clouds, 100% covered. We're basically launching these things in soup. Yes, sir.
In this simulation, it's amazing that NASA looked at the facility there in its
Mm-hmm.
because lightning, Florida has the most lightning that anybody.
There's one place on the earth that has more, and it's a little African country. I forget the name of off the top of my head. But definitely in the United States, it's Lightning Alley. It has the most cloud-to-ground lightning.
I see a lot of research where they shoot rockets in the air with one has to track lightning for the reason.
Well, there's a... You're ahead of me, but we'll go ahead and bring up these slides. Good point. So here's the map. Look at Florida. It's Lightning Alley. We picked the most lightning-prone place in the country to launch our rockets from. But there's a couple of reasons for it. It's got this great open sea here that we can launch out safely. Certainly, there's lots of room up here as well. I mean, we put a spaceport here. It's closer to the equator. It's for energy. The Earth is a greater diameter there, therefore it's traveling at a greater speed. It's a matter of 100 miles an hour or so between here and the Kennedy Space Center. Now the Europeans put their space facility in French Guiana, which you can just about throw a baseball and hit the equator with. Great place to put a spaceport. Mm-hmm.
Does the distance from the land to sky make a difference where we go towards the equator?
Should you put your launch facility on top of a mountain? Is that what you're thinking?
On the equator.
Yeah, on the equator. That'd probably be a pretty good place to do it. Yeah,
Is that part of the reason, though, that it's actually closer to the...
not really. Not really, because it's not so much about reaching space. When we think about launching a rocket, we think about it in terms of going straight up. Because from our perspective, that's what it looks like. But if you really watch that smoke plume, we're not launching up, we're launching out. Because the goal, and it doesn't matter whether you're going into low Earth orbit to reach the International Space Station or you're trying to go to Mars. The goal is to go into Earth orbit first. Everything goes into Earth orbit first. And to get into Earth orbit, you've got to reach 17,500 miles an hour.
It varies
slightly
by the mass of the vehicle, but not by
much.
That's the
magic.
17,500
miles an hour.
So whether you launch from the top of
Mount
Mount
Everest,
or you launch from
the
Death Valley,
Death Valley,
you still got to
reach that speed.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think I know why. The equator is much angular velocity.
Exactly.
Enough to send that rocket up into space quicker without having to use much fuel.
So here's North Carolina, in case anybody's interested. We don't have too many bases here, but many launch pads. But thought you might be interested to see what our lightning profile looked like.
The African countries.
Thank you. So you mentioned an experiment. This is done in Florida. This is done by the American Geophysical Union, where they actually hang a wire off the bottom of the rocket. And this will replay again in slow motion. But this is in the right conditions. There have been lightning strikes in the area, but simply that rocket being in the air is enough to generate lightning, and that energy wants to go somewhere. So in this case, it's going down the wire, and the wire actually exploded in this example. It's going down the wire to the ground. In the case of a Saturn V or some other rocket, it's going to go down that plume. It's going to go down the exhaust plume. Move back. Okay. So enough on Apollo 12. So STS-51L. This is probably the other of the most major launches that had weather issues. So this was Challenger. I personally was in high school when this happened. I was sitting in driver's ed. We happened to have TV on at the time, and we watched it happen live. So I remember this very, very well. It was 31 degrees out. I've talked with folks that live down there. You're nodding your head yes. And the stories I've heard about this was it was abnormally cold. Well, that's obvious from this. But what was also weird about it, and backed me up on this, was there was no wind. It was really, really calm. So that, and here's the moment of it happening. You can actually see basically fire leaking out of the solid rocket boosters at those joints. The solid rocket boosters that are on the side of the shuttle that are expended after they've served their purpose to overcome Earth's gravity. Those are shipped in segments and O-rings between them to keep all that sealed up. So that's what's happening here, is it's leaking out through that O-ring. But the debris cloud, the smoke, the aftermath hung in the sky for hours afterwards and was visible from all over Central Florida. So this happened January 28th, 86. It happened at just a minute over tea time after launch time, and the crew of 7 was lost, obviously. So this is a plot of some tests that were done by Morton Thiokol. Not Morton Thiokol. Well, they're now known as ATK, but the folks that were responsible for putting that solid rocket booster together. And I was actually just working with my son on his math today, and he's working on scatter plots. And I showed him this one. I said, this is why this stuff is important, is you can't test all of the parameters. You can't test infinitely. You've got to take different test points and come up with some sort of a story to go with it. So this is the fitted line that they came up with from these test points here. The blue marks are the test points. So what's interesting about this is where their testing stopped. See, they stopped testing at about 50 degrees. And the failure occurred at 31 degrees. So they did not have the data that they needed to make the decisions that they made. And I've got a quote on the next slide that will demonstrate that some. But furthermore, there were, and this is a part of the Challenger Commission accident report. You can download it. You can read through it. It's 100-plus pages. It's very, very dry, but there's a couple of places in there that are rather telling, and this is one of them. Aldrich, who was responsible for this report, pointed out that the ambient temperature the rule that they had at the time was the ambient temperature must be at or above 31 degrees Fahrenheit. They met the launch weather criteria. They did the right thing as far as they knew at the time. However, overnight, the temperature had dipped down several times. And I've got launch weather criteria for several vehicles here I'll point to in a minute. And listen as I go through a couple of the points there. You'll hear this echoed in the current launch weather criteria. They learned a lot from this. They learned a lot from Apollo 12. What they learned here was, the letter of the law is great, but it's got to be the right letter. And also, if there's been things that have happened overnight, we need to take that into account as well. So those O-rings had been freezing overnight. The pad was covered in ice. So let's get on to, get away from history a little bit. Let's look at the current day. So this is what came out of all of that. This is what came out of learning over all those several hundred launches from the Cape. So this is the instrumentation that's at Cape Canaveral right now. And if you've ever been down there on vacation, you probably driven past some of these things and never noticed them. They're on out. So Orlando's down here. That's the beeline. That's how you get to Orlando. You got to take this fork here to either going up to Titusville and the Space Coast, or on out to Cocoa Beach and visit with I Dream of Jeannie. But you see each one of these towers here? Those are out in fields. Those are out, beef farmers have them in the middle of their fields. They're in the middle of some subdivisions that have cropped up there. But these are towers that are measuring things like wind speeds. They're measuring temperatures. Because weather does move, and north is this way. Weather does move across the state quite a bit from the Gulf towards the Atlantic Ocean. So that's catching those things there. Well, then you get up to, these are essentially isthmuses and islands that constitute both NASA property and Air Force property. But this is probably the most instrumented couple square miles on the Earth when it comes to weather. And they have the ability to measure wind speeds and temperatures and pressures, and there's Doppler radars there, but there's also something called field mills, which I'll talk about in a bit. But you can kind of see some of the items that are there. The field mills are really interesting. They're dotted all over everywhere, and I happened to stand next to one when I was there for the launch of STS-131, and I didn't recognize it at first because it looks like a weird kind of thing. Let me switch there. So this is what a field mill looks like. This is a picture I took near one of the points where the press can set up their cameras. And what it is a rotating disc that is constantly measuring the electric potential of the air. And once it reaches a certain level, it's in the launch commit criteria now. It's measuring the potential for lightning. So once it hits that threshold, shut everything down. We're going to come fly another day. That's what they look like on the inside. You actually build them yourself. They're fairly simple. Simple instruments. So the 45th Weather Squadron, this is what these guys put out. And you can go online and look at these. If you're ever sitting watching a launch from the Cape, go to, you can just Google 45th Weather Squadron, and the first link you're going to bring up is going to have a couple of links on there. You pick the vehicle that's launching. If it's an Atlas, if it's a Falcon with SpaceX, shuttle's obviously not on there anymore. But any vehicle that's going to launch from the Cape, you're going to be able to see this. So this is the kind of product that they put out. And this is meant for the general public's consumption. The report that's going to the launch weather officer that's sitting at missions or sitting at launch control, making decisions, is quite a bit more complicated than this. This kind of gives you a really good idea on whether or not we're going to launch today. So when you see on the news a couple of days ahead of time when they say, there's 40% go weather, that's where this is coming from. In this case, it was 90% go. Just subtract, because the weather folks are talking in terms of what might violate. That's what they're thinking of. So 10% chance that something's going to come up that could violate the launch weather criteria. Their primary concerns are mentioned, and those are coming out of here. They're coming out of the launch commit criteria. So here, one day it was thick clouds, the next day it was cumulus. They generally put these reports out in terms of when that first launch attempt is going to be, and then 24 hours later, because should they not make it, should it be scrubbed that first attempt, it's going to happen 24 hours later. And sunrise and moonrise are mentioned. You'll see mentions in there of things like space weather. If there are extreme events going on in the sun, if we're seeing some solar mass ejections, coronal mass ejections that are happening at the time, it could violate some of these rules. These rules are terribly, terribly complicated. So here's another one. That previous one was for a Falcon launch last year. So this is the Delta IV Heavy that launched, was it a week ago, week and a half ago? It was a week ago tomorrow, with the Orion mission. So they came up with a totally different set of launch criteria. And this is for that first day. And we ended up not flying that first day. And it was for a couple of reasons. Some of them were technical. We ended up having a valve that was giving us problems on the rocket. But also we had the wind rules were violated several times. And they're measured at various points on the launch structure. So I want to say that the rule was they couldn't go over 31 knots, and it peaked that a couple of times. But it's actually more complicated than that because that rule varies based on which way the wind's coming from. It's because these are very tall vehicles, and there's also another assembly building that's next to it that can block the wind. So they're trying to find that couple of minute window where they can get the rocket off. And that's why having a nice large launch window like they did, I want to say it was two and a half hours, something like that, is nice. They didn't end up doing it, but they did get it off the next day. So that's what those look like. And you can look at these right online. Here's the URL. I can share that later, but you can look at these right online. It's great information to have if you're trying to watch a launch. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question, I was watching it over the web, so my video wasn't very good. It looked to me like the ceiling was pretty low. The cloud ceiling was low. Am I correct in what I saw, or was it just a bad video? When we launched last week, last week.
There were clouds in the area, but I tried to get the commit criteria for the Delta IV rocket before coming tonight, so I could answer questions like that. Was unable to get it. That is a rocket that is owned by United Launch Alliance. They're the provider, and because that particular vehicle launches some missions that we're not supposed to know about for people that don't exist within our federal government. That's what I was told, at least, is the reason I can't get a hold of those. Yeah, they're considered company private too. That was the commit criteria for that particular vehicle. And that can also change on a per payload basis too. It tends to get a little more strict depending on the payload, but I forget what the cloud level was at the time. Anybody recognize these? Anybody tell me what kind of clouds these are? Yes, sir.
Cumulonimbus.
Specifically, what kind of cumulonimbus? What's the nickname for this? It's based on the shape. Thunderheads and anvil cloud. These are very bad things. If you see these and you're out at the Cape, going to watch a launch, go ahead and pack up your launch gear because you're probably not going to fly that day. It can happen, and I should point out with those percentages we saw earlier, I've seen launches happen with a 90% no-go prediction. I've seen launches scrub for weather with a 10% no-go. It's whatever happens at that moment in time, the goal is to get that rocket off when they can and get it off safely. So these are very, very bad things. And they're very bad things because of lightning. They produce lightning. So I mentioned the field mills. Here's the coverage for basically lightning detectors on the Cape. And you can see we've got pretty good coverage there. This is the Air Force Station. This is where most of the launches are happening right now. That's where the Atlas V launches from. The Delta IV Heavy we saw launch last week launched from there. Right up in this area is where the Falcon launches from. And up here is where the Saturn Vs and the shuttles launch from. Very soon we're going to see some other vehicles launch from there. So we got good coverage there. There's the field mills. We saw that. We saw that. We saw that. There we go. So here's kind of an overview of the Kennedy Space Center. So this is Rocket Row, if you will. And the history of our rocket program is along with these launch pads here. Most of them are not active anymore. We only have 4 active launch pads there. This is the skid strip. That's the landing point for that's the airport for the Kennedy. I'm sorry, for Cape Canaveral. That's where the shuttle used to land. That's the 37A complex, I believe. B is above there. That's where the Saturn V launched from, and where shuttle launched from. But on down here is where all of the current missions launch from. So right there is where Orion launched from. So down here are the fine folks in the 45th Weather Squadron. If you've ever taken a cruise, that's where you cruised out of. So this is what it looks like from the air. It's one of the most secure places I've ever been in. And I used to work DoD jobs back in the day. A couple of nice men with very large guns met me at the gate and checked my passport. Made sure I had an appointment there. But very nice folks inside. You can see it's a pretty big facility. They've got radars out here off to the side, are a couple of towers that are measuring various things. This is what it looks like from the front. And this is the crew. So it's a number of enlisted personnel. It's a number of officers. All have meteorology degrees. There's a couple of researchers from various universities in Florida. And they are on station, especially the couple of days before launches, 24/7. This is what some of the consoles look like. I wrote a piece on this for a STEM-focused magazine that's aimed at middle schoolers. And we did a bit on these folks and what it takes to do the launch weather forecast. So with that, I have time for questions. Actually, let me go through a few of these first and give you an idea of some of the things that are the same and some of the things that are different with the weather criteria. So I'm going to start with the Falcon 9, because that's the next one that's going to launch. It actually just got delayed, I saw on the way over. I want to say it's later in December. They were hoping to get it off a little bit earlier. So do not launch at sustained winds at the 162-foot level of the launch pad exceeds 30 knots. So that's 30 knots for Falcon 9. So we got one sheet summary for Falcon 9. I'm going to move on to Shuttle. Shuttle's summary is 6 pages long. So you can imagine what the detailed one looks like. Let's see what our winds are for. Okay, for tanking, we have separate weather rules for tanking, meaning fueling of the rocket. We can go up to 42 knots. That's great. At launch, we are going to be somewhere between 19 and 34 knots is when we're going to say no-go. And where that 19 to 34 depends is, again, wind direction. So terribly complicated. And actually the wind speed, there's a chart in here, right here, that tells us that the wind speed, the allowable wind speed, depends on relative humidity. Again, it's because of freezing. We learned a lot from there. And on freezing, let's look back at temperature. We saw the some of the temperatures that were going on during the Apollo days, and then obviously the problem that happened with Challenger brought up a lot of concerns about temperature. The 24 average temperature, if it's been below 41 degrees, we're going to stop. We're going to wait until the next day to launch. If the temperature has fallen below 33 degrees any time during the previous 24 hours, does that sound familiar? That was the major problem during Challenger. We had that drop down into the low 20s several times. We don't just need to be at a specific temperature at launch time. These vehicles are sitting out there on launch pads for days at a time, sometimes weeks, exposed to the elements, and we need to keep that in mind. If temperature is lower than the prescribed minimum value for longer than 30 minutes, unless sun angle, wind temperature, and relative humidity. So these are very, very complicated rules. So let me, into mission, landing weather flight rules. So there was a set of criteria for landing the shuttle at the Kennedy Space Center. Cloud coverage of 4/8 or less. The National Weather Service does their cloud coverage in 8s for some reason. I've never understood it. Less below 8,000 feet and a visibility of 5 miles or greater is required. If you've ever seen any video of the shuttle landing or heard any stories about what it's like to land it, it's like landing a brick. You want to have some good visibility there, so that's the reason those are there. Peak crosswind cannot exceed 15 knots. 15 knots is not a whole lot, but again, if you're flying a brick, you want a nice calm wind. Headwind can exceed 25 knots. No thunderstorm or lightning precipitation activity. And one of the rules on shuttle that was pretty interesting. Smoke plume. Do not launch if the flight path will carry the vehicle through any cumulus cloud that has developed from a smoke plume. Clouds can develop from smoke. If the smoke plume is still attached, again, you got a vehicle going up through that can generate lightning, and you got a nice path to the ground. We're very, very concerned about lightning. And I'll leave this up here if you guys want to dig through it. There's also some Atlas V rules in here. They did put out the commit criteria for Atlas V during the MSL launch, during the Curiosity launch. It's kind of hard to get a hold of those. And I've yet to get commit criteria out of orbital for the Ares launches. I just like watching these things. When you're trying to watch the mission get off, and you're keeping an eye on the weather, as we saw in there, it's worked very well for the mission too. With that, I have time for questions.
Yeah, Tony, last Thursday morning, the very first delay was a range incursion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was a sightseeing boat or what. How often does that happen?
In my experience, more often than it should. The last Antares launch, where we lost that vehicle, the first launch attempt was delayed because of another boat incursion. And again, it's at Kennedy, it's the Air Force Base down there. It's Patrick Air Force Base that is managing some of that along with the Coast Guard. In Virginia, it's the state, and I believe the Coast Guard helps out there as well. But they'll actually fly helicopters out and communicate with these boaters and make sure they know that they're in the area. And the way to prevent that, how it's supposed to work, it generally works pretty well, but as you mentioned, we do see boat incursions quite a bit lately, is there's a notice to mariners that's put out about 2 weeks before a launch that specifies the polygon off the coast that's the unsafe zone. And whenever something strays into that, it goes back to some of the weather things that we were talking about. It's based on the flight of the vehicle. If they were to have to destroy the vehicle, something or it destroy itself, where is that going to land? Because if that's the momentum of the launch, it's not going to fall straight to the ocean. It's going to continue moving. So that polygon, when you look at it, that should show you, that should tell you where they believe that, not believe, where they know that that debris is going to land. So we don't want the chance of debris landing on a boat.
I was wondering, are there any ocean conditions that go into the parameters for launch?
There's buoys. Thank you for reminding me of that. There's, I want to say, about 20 or 30 buoys offshore that are measuring temperature and winds and things like that. But back in the shuttle days, there was a boat. There were two boats that were part of the shuttle launches. And they would typically go out several days ahead of time, sometimes as much as a week ahead of time. And if they were unable to do that because there was a storm coming through, that was another criteria we wouldn't launch. We had to have those boats out there to retrieve the solid rocket boosters and bring them back in for refurbishing. They'd go out there and ride some horrendous storms, though. They were pretty hardy sailors, but there was some they couldn't even weather.
Are rockets getting struck today? How often can they get struck? Burn?
We've learned not to launch in conditions that could cause them to be struck. I can't remember the last time one was struck. Yes, sir.
Question. How about any of the kind of downrange landing fields? How are they?
For shuttle?
Yeah, shuttle. How much more restrictive or maybe lax were they as far as those?
They had their own set of criteria. The same kind of visual and crosswind and lightning and all those other criteria that were present for the Kennedy Space Center were also present for those overseas landing areas. And the nice thing about those was we had multiple of them, and they would stand at least two of them up, depending on the mission, and sometimes they'd stand up more than that if there were concerns about weather. Only one of them had to be meet the criteria. And they would actually make the overseas landing site decision during the last couple of seconds of the countdown. Program the computers. There is literally a switch on the console where they would switch from Spain to Madrid to, well, I forget where they all were. They've changed up over the years. And there was a couple along the East Coast that were super backup sites. Their goal was to get it back to the Kennedy Space Center. And most launches, or most strokes of the shuttle were not due to launch restrictions. They were due to return to landing site restrictions. We had to be able to get the shuttle back in an emergency. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
does NASA have any dealings with some of the launch sites up here north of Virginia, like that one where the rocket failed and was burned up?
That is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, MARS, which I think is a horrible acronym, but there we are. We haven't launched anything to Mars from there, but we have launched things to the moon. That is a part of the Wallops Flight Facility, which is managed by the Goddard Flight Center, which is a NASA facility. So that is a NASA facility with some local private management there. So NASA does launch vehicles from there through private contractors. Orbital Sciences out of Northern Virginia is the one that launches there. NASA doesn't launch its own vehicles. They tend to hire a ride on other people's vehicles. But yes, they do have all sorts of dealings up there. We're launching to the International Space Station from there.
And can they launch these heavy vehicles like they do down at Texas Airport?
Every launch pad is custom to the vehicle that launches from there. So when I mention all of those along the coast of Cape Canaveral, each one of those launch pads can handle a certain type of vehicle. Where SpaceX launches from handles only Falcon 9s right now. Where the Atlas V launches from handles only Atlas vehicles. Where the Delta IV Heavy launched from this past week handles only Delta vehicles. That's going to change. The Launchpad 37A and 37B, where we launched the Saturn V run from, was completely redone for shuttle. It was redone to handle shuttle. Going forward, 37A and 37B are being configured in a more generic way that should be able to launch multiple vehicles. A lot cheaper way of doing things. It just makes more sense.
Yeah, you were talking about temperature, light, wind,
Mhm.
how far up to the rock?
All in here. It's mostly about upper level winds and upper level clouds. It does not extend too far out into the ocean. It's mostly about things right around the launch pad. Frankly, because that's what we can measure the best. We've got some instrumentation there. We've got most of the instrumentation there and know what's happening up to a couple thousand feet. There are weather balloons that are launched continuously during a launch day to measure some of those upper atmosphere conditions. But it's not the data that comes back is not at the same granularity. So some restrictions are placed on that.
Our country would have to have much more.
Which one was it?
Yeah. I thought it said.
They have a bit too, I believe. Sorry.
Can satellite video basically part of the large and get data from the upper atmosphere?
You can't park a satellite in low Earth orbit.
Absolutely.
Well, they are geosynchronous, and we do make use of weather satellites in this whole decision-making process. But you bring up the International Space Station, and that's a good point. Now we're back into the business of launching capsules that have to be recovered in the ocean. Russia has capsules as well. We recovered theirs through a desert. We recover ours from an ocean off the coast of Baja. So we had to take measurements of the weather at the coast too to make sure that it was safe for recovery. That was done a couple different ways. We parked a ship out there that has all sorts of meteorological instruments and has weather personnel on there. We launched a drone from the Armstrong base in California. It's a version of the Predator drone that flew around out there and got some great video of actually the capsule and the chute. But the International Space Station has meteorological instruments on it as well. As we make passes over, again, it's just passes, about every 90 minutes it's rotating the Earth. Those instruments were used to take some measurements of wave height, winds, things like that. So that's a component as well now. One there and one there. You're good.
On high altitude winds, such as jet streams, high altitude winds, are there, how sensitive are the rockets to those high altitude winds? Sometimes they'll get up around 150 miles an hour, but the air is not that dense and not fast.
I don't know the answer to your question. I suspect you may have a a good handle on it. Because of the less dense air, it's probably not as much of a problem. More of a factor at Wallops, more of a factor up in Virginia, I would think, because the jet stream does move over that part of the country. The jet stream generally gets down very often. It's another good reason to put it down there.
Can we get more details on the SEC to Hawks?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I forget the engineer's name. I can look it up here at the end, but I was one engineer in launch control. The rocket was hit by lightning after it shut down. So you've got 3 guys sitting there flying blind, literally. And they're trying everything they can think of to get it back up. So one engineer had remembered from simulations that he had been involved in on the ground that should that kind of overvoltage happen, the only way to reboot the vehicle was to move a particular switch. It was the SCE switch. I forget what SCE stands for, but move it to the auxiliary position. And everything glowed like a candle after that. So listen to those young engineers. Sometimes they know what they're talking about. Yeah, that was not too much voltage. That was too much data being fed into the computer. And that young engineer she was 31 years old. There was a young lady that was responsible for, she was chief programming for the on Apollo, and she was the one that made that call. And said, you can ignore that alarm. Our software can handle it. They just like to bike off the top, but they need those bikes down to the bottom to make sure they landed safely. The Apollo 11, find some books or some good documentaries on it. The landing of Apollo 11 did not go up. It almost did not happen. They were seconds away from the plane and back up into orbit. That sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right.
John W. Aaron.
Yeah.
Yeah, the last shuttle on the town is that. And the drill back fast. Still wrong. And how you couldn't see it.
I was amazed. I was standing at the Wright Brothers Memorial out in Kitty Hawk. We had a couple hundred people sitting around. We were running it live over NASA TV. Really cool place to be. It was the only place I would be if I couldn't be at the Cape. Was out there to see it, steps away from where the Wright Brothers the first flight. And we get to T0, and I was amazed that they actually went forth with it. Because based on everything I'd seen in the previous launches, it did not look like that they would. Perhaps, I don't know.
The arm was indicated that it's not trapped. Go ahead, come on.
We'll have visual confirmation.
Yeah, but still, the bottom is down to the last second.
There's computers that make a relevant decision, and if you watch really close and during the round group, they actually put some computers background that were making the decisions about when. To make up for this, they moved the threshold from 31 miles an hour down to 29 miles an hour, but the decisions we made by computers. Sometimes they have to pull these automation pieces off, because one of these launches has to go like that too. And you have to be a little bit flexible, I suppose. Quite a number of the have been refurbished. The avionics and such have been upgraded. Parts for that rocket is alright. Primary purpose is to overcome gravity, get it up to speed that can get up to Earth orbit, low Earth orbit. Flying rides. At least one, maybe two for watching. It's a horrible movie.
Oh, Stanley, once again, I think the one.
On SDS 135.
Again, they're just looking for that hole big enough if they want to. And if the shuttle is still safe at the end of the
Saw something. That says on southeast space. So many satellites.
Several all the Earth orbit satellites, all of geosynchronous. We got the full satellite kind of wrapping around the planet. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, can you guys hold off for a second? Never mind. We gotta work on this.